So now that I've described this idea about interpretation and this shared theory of art that we have when we look at work, I'm going to describe a little bit about what my theory is. So this is a picture of me in my studio, surrounded by a lot of my little friends. As a way of biography, I was born in Berlin in 1964. My father was in the military, and at the time the military thought absolutely nothing about moving in a family around every couple of years and uprooting us and putting us in kind of dangerous places. My mom used to tell me a story about how they were on the Autobahn and they heard on the radio that Kennedy had been assassinated. And she was terrified because she thought the Russians were just going to roll through Berlin and that was going to be it. So it was a pretty unusual life that we had. My father was an embassy guard. He did radio work, so he probably did some kind of spy work, I would imagine what you could call it. And we were going to go off to Hungary in 1967, but then there was the revolution in Hungary, so then we were going to go to Moscow instead. So, you know, out of the frying pan into the fire kind of a thing. So we were back in the States. My father was in training in Florida, or I can't remember if it was Florida or Delaware. He was never around. I was very young when this all happened. And he died suddenly. It was 1967. I was 3. He was 32. Our life changed radically after that happened. You know, we didn't travel anymore. My mom took my sister and I back to her family in northern Indiana. So I was raised in Mishawaka. So you're well from Indiana, we know where that's at, right? Okay. Good. I don't have to explain it because every time I talk to somebody in Chicago, it's like, Mishawaka what? Notre Dame. So my life after that tumultuous, very early couple of years of my life was very settled. I mean, I lived in a small town. I went to high school. I went to school, junior high school, had a very stable life, as much as we could coming from a single family home, or single parent home, which wasn't as common in the 70s as it is now. So my mom never wanted to remarry. And she did the best she could to give us a normal life, and for the most part, she did. But it's very hard to get over the idea of, you know, what would happen if my father had lived a little while longer, maybe another 10 years, maybe another 20 years. And the other thing that keeps coming up is it's odd to have somebody who's so important in your life be known more by their absence than by their presence. And that has a bearing on my work. And that is because, I think the main reason why it has a bearing on my work is that those events that happen to you when you're very young, they loom very large in your mind, whether you can remember them or not, because those are things that you have nothing to compare to. There are things that you can't, you know, say, I can ignore this because I've been through worse. I was 3 years old, and I hadn't been through worse. It looms very large in my mind. So let's talk a bit about some work. So I'm going to pull some slides up from the pieces in the show and talk a little bit about them, about the work in specific and some of the ideas behind them in general. So this is a piece called Mummer. It's been up in the gallery for about half a year now because it was in the Salon show and now it's in this show. And ironically, it's in the same place for both shows. And it wasn't intentional. I asked Bridget about it. I thought, oh, she just left it there. No, it wasn't intentional. So the first thing you'll notice about it is it's very heavily painted. And I get this question all the time. Why such heavy paint? Well, a lot like Corey, I love oil paint. I love the smell of it. I love working with it, and I love its plastic qualities. The qualities it has of clay, like how it can feel like clay. I use very little medium in my work. I usually just paint straight from the tube. I mix it and I lay it on. And I also lay on several layers at a time, or over the course of the painting. This painting actually has another painting underneath it. So I had to paint extra heavy to cover it up. So there's probably 3 layers of paint for the first painting, and then 3 or 4 layers of paint for this painting to get this to where it's at. All painted with as much gusto as I possibly could manage. There's no, I don't put any washes or anything down on work. The piece itself is called Mummer, and titles are very important to me in my work, and the word mummer actually refers to a pantomime actor. So if any of you have ever been to Canada during the holidays, like the fall holidays, they don't have Halloween, they have Mummers Day. And then in England, they have Mummers plays, and they're just plays done in pantomime. And when I was working on this, I was thinking about the idea of somebody being in a position that they weren't qualified to be in. Somebody who was a fake, and somebody who was worried about being found out. And that's, in a nutshell, what I was thinking when I was making it. What you think about it is probably going to be very different, because you're probably going to unpack it differently than what I did, when I actually made it, and that's perfectly fine. The next piece I'm going to talk about, this is a piece called King of Fools, and it's, if you've been up to the show and seen the wall of small paintings that are of mine, this is in one of those small paintings. And I wanted to bring it up here because it represents a series of paintings that I've been doing off and on since, I want to say, the late 90s. And they're called the mask paintings. And they're basically, they're tronies. And if you ever heard the term tronie, it's a Dutch term. And it means a made-up face. And originally it meant more like a caricature, because there were extreme faces. Like if you saw something where somebody was like screaming or laughing with their mouth fully open, you couldn't have a model sit for that. So the artist would just make it up, and it became a tronie. But now, as the word caricature has come to mean extreme facial features, the word tronie just basically means made-up face. I travel a lot. I was on public transportation a lot. I see a lot of faces, and I have a very good memory for pieces of faces. So a nose here, a lip there, big ears, unusual eyes. And when I'm painting, I try to remember these things and make distinctive faces out of generic ideas. And then the idea of the King of Fools, I just like the idea of somebody who thinks that they're a king and actually is wearing a box on their head. This is a little painting called Gentleman Caller, and it's part of a series called Killing Eternity. Killing Eternity was a series of devils that I did. There's a couple other pieces in the show of my devils. And I got this idea from watching a documentary about Rod Serling, and them talking about how he had been producing hard-hitting, socially aware dramas in his early career, but no advertisers wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. They were afraid that they were going to offend their viewers. So he left New York, which is where his TV show was produced at the time, and he went back to, I think he was from Connecticut or someplace else on the East Coast. And he came up with the idea of the Twilight Zone. And he basically said, I can tell any story I want to about racism and anti-religious sentiment and whatever social commentary I want to make, as long as they're done with monsters and aliens. And so I did a cycle of paintings based on devils. And of course I was talking about people. This is the largest painting of mine that's in the show. This is called Pyle's Regiment. And this is also the last painting I did in the Killing Eternity series. The Pyle I'm referring to is Ernie Pyle, not Gomer. And some of you may know that Ernie Pyle was a reporter in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And not to disparage him in his writing at all, but the reason why I entitled this Pyle's Regiment is because he is most often given credit for the phrase, "There are no atheists in foxholes." That may be true, but that doesn't mean you're fighting for the right side. Now, this is where things get hairy. I gotta see if I can get this to work. I'm gonna end this display of work with a video. So that gives you an idea of my process. And it also gives you an idea of my influences. The other things that I hear a lot from when people look at my work, I do get a lot of comments like, your work is really dark. Yeah, that's true, it is. Although I prefer to say it's not dark, but it does shine a light into dark places. But the other thing I hear is your work is very literate. It seems to refer to something else, or it's editorial. I know you're trying to say something, I just don't know what it is. I hear that fairly often too. And it's intentional. The titles mean something to me. So there is a literary component to what I do. And I do want them to be visually interesting, but also intellectually and narratively literate in the same case, in the same situation. And that pretty much wraps it up. Does anyone have any questions? I'd be surprised if you don't. No?
No.
Oh, I'm hurt.
Dave.
Dave?
Your layers of paint are so thick, and is there, like, when you put on one layer, is there a waiting period?
Oh, yes. Dave was asking about time spent between layers of paint. I'll wait a week, 2 weeks to be between layers of paint. So these things take months to do, and I just keep them in my studio. I look at them out of the corner of my eye, so when I push them again, I'll know what I'm going to do with them next. And that's true of almost everything that I do. The other thing about it is I also paint on board. So I don't paint on canvas anymore for the most part because I don't want to paint the crack.
So your work reminds me a lot of the German expressionists of the early 20th century. Marcia, as an art history teacher as well, just find it so interesting that you were born in Germany at the age of 3 and that
Yeah, I think about that a lot too, because it would have been the atmosphere, because we spent most of our time in the American part of the city. I mean, we had very little contact with the culture.
I guess my question was just, I mean, are they an intentional?
I'm interested in them, but there are other artists who I find more interesting. So my main,
artists?
when I was in college, the artist that had the most influence on me was Francis Bacon, the English painter. There's a very famous painting of his at the Art Institute of Chicago, which I've seen and studied for hours. It's a great painting. Then I'm also very influenced by Philip Guston.
Here.
Yeah,
As
I think
everybody
is-
should be.
I think is a phenomenal painter and a phenomenal colorist, and then my spiritual antecedent is James Ensor, the Belgian painter. I find the German expressions a little sloppy. Any other questions? I think Corey and I will be upstairs in the exhibit.
Yes.
And if you have questions specifically about pieces in the exhibit, you want to come up and talk to us, we'll be there. Have at it.